Hello and welcome to Emergency Care and Transportation of the Sick and Injured. This is Chapter 6, The Human Body. After completing this chapter and the related coursework, you will be able to describe and apply in context the body planes, topographical anatomy, and anatomic position. You will also be able to identify basic anatomic structures and related functions and describe each body system. And you will also be able to discuss the roles of the structures within these systems and the interaction of body systems in maintaining the life support chain. You will also be able to discuss possible consequences of illness and injury of these structures and systems on proper functioning of the body. A working knowledge of anatomy is important. This knowledge of anatomy helps to communicate correct information to other medical professionals and to others who may not understand medical terms. Let's discuss topographic anatomy. This applies or refers to the superficial landmarks that serve as guides to structures that lie beneath them. Topographic anatomy applies to the body in the anatomical position so that everyone is referring to the body in the same way. The anatomic or anatomical position is when the patient stands facing you, arms at their side, palms forward. Directional terms are always from the patient's perspective, the patient's left and the patient's right. The planes of the body are imaginary straight lines that divide the body. The three main areas are depending on how the body is divided. You have the frontal or coronal plane, which divides the front from body front and back. The transverse or axial plane, which divides the body top and bottom, and the sagittal or lateral plane, which divides the body left and right. The mid-sagittal or midline plane is a special type of sagittal plane where the body is cut in half, leaving equal left and right halves. This figure shows the planes dividing the body. Let's move into straight anatomy. The first thing we're going to discuss is the skeletal system. The skeleton is what gives us our recognizable human form and protects vital internal organs. The elements of the skeleton consist of 206 bones that constitute the complete structure of the skeletal system, and the elements of the skeleton provide a framework for attachment of muscles. With the attachments, you have ligaments that are fibrous tissues that connect bones to each other, and tendons, which are rope-like structures that connect muscles to bones. Then you have cartilage, which is smooth connective tissue that covers the ends of bones at mobile joints, like your knees or your shoulders, for example. The skeletal system is divided into two portions, the axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is the foundation to which the arms and legs are attached. This includes the skull, the cranium in the skull, which protects the brain, connects to the spinal cord through a large opening at the base of the skull called the foramen magnum, and the skull cranium is made up of 4 bones. The posterior of the cranium is called the occiput. The lateral portions of the cranium are called the temples or temporal bones. And between the temporal regions and occiput are the parietal bones, and the forehead is the frontal bone. The facial bones are made up of 14 bones total. You have the upper unmovable jawbone, which is the maxillae, the cheekbones, which are called zygomas. The lower movable portion of the jaw is called the mandible. Orbits, which are the eye sockets, include zygomas, maxillae, and frontal bones of the cranium. And you have very, very short bones that form the bridge of the nose. The skeleton also includes the spinal column. The spinal column is the central supporting structure of the body. It's composed of 33 bones called vertebrae, and vertebrae are named according to the section of the spine in which they lie and are numbered from top to bottom. The spine is divided into 5 sections, top to bottom. You have the cervical spine, which is the neck. This includes 7 vertebrae and attached to the skull. Then you have the thoracic spine, which is the upper back, and 1 pair of ribs is attached to each of the 12 vertebrae that make up the thoracic spine. The lumbar spine, which is the lower back, contains 5 vertebrae. Then you have the sacrum, which is the back wall of the pelvis. The sacrum is of 5 vertebrae that are fused together to form the sacrum, and the sacrum joins the pelvis. Then you have the coccyx or tailbone, which are 4 fused vertebrae. The vertebrae are connected by ligaments with intervertebral discs between each vertebra. Then you have the thorax. The thoracic cavity contains the heart, lungs, esophagus, and great vessels, the aorta and vena cava. It's formed by 12 thoracic vertebrae and 12 pair of ribs. The midline of the chest is the sternum. The superior border of the sternum forms the easily palpable sternal notch. There are 3 components: the manubrium, which is the upper section, the body, and the xiphoid process, which is a narrow cartilaginous tip. And these are the 3 components of the sternum. This is a slide of the skull, and it illustrates the different bones and sections of the skull that I discussed earlier. This is an illustration of the spinal column that I just explained, composed of 33 vertebrae divided into 5 sections. You have the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, sacrum, and coccyx, top to bottom. And this is a slide of the thorax that I just explained, formed by 12 thoracic vertebrae and 12 pairs of ribs, and contains the heart, lungs, esophagus, and the great blood vessels. This also includes joints, upper extremities, the pelvis, and the lower extremities. Joints occur whenever bones come into contact. Joints consist of the ends of the bones and the surrounding connecting and supporting tissues. You have a symphysis, which is a joint with slight limited motion in which the bone's ends are held together by fibrous tissue. The bone ends of a joint are held together by a fibrous sac called a joint capsule. They may be lax and thin, which allows motion, or thick, which resists stretching or bending. In moving joints, a thin layer of articular cartilage covers the ends of the bones. And there's a synovial membrane, which is an inner lining of the joint capsule, and it's responsible for making a thick lubricant called synovial fluid. There are 2 types of joints. You have ball and socket joint, which are like shoulders, which allow rotation and bending, and a hinge joint, which is what you find in fingers, elbows, and knees, which are the largest joints in the body. The motion is restricted to flexion, which is bending and extension only. Joints occur wherever bones come into contact. The joints consist of the ends of the bones and the surrounding connecting and supporting tissues. There's a symphysis, which is a joint with slight limited motion in which the bone ends are held together by a fibrous tissue. The bone ends of a joint are held together by a fibrous sac called a joint capsule. It may be lax and thin, which allows motion, or thick, which resists stretching or bending. In moving joints, a thin layer of articular cartilage covers the ends of the bones. There's also a synovial membrane, which is the inner lining of the joint capsule, and this is responsible for making a thick lubricant called synovial fluid. There are 2 types of joints. You have a ball and socket joint, such as you find in the shoulders, which allows rotation and bending, and a hinge joint, which you find in like fingers, elbows, and knees. And knees, by the way, are the largest joints in the body. This is motion that's restricted to flexion, which is bending and extension only. This figure shows the example of ball and socket and hinge joints. You have the upper extremities, which extend from shoulder, girdle to fingertips. It's composed of arms, forearms, hands, and fingers. With the upper extremities, you have a shoulder that extends from the shoulder girdle to the fingertips, and this is composed of arms, forearms, hands, and fingers. The shoulder girdle itself is where 3 bones come together. You have the clavicle, which is the collarbone, the scapula, which is the shoulder blade, and the humerus, which is the upper or supporting bone of the arm. In the arm, you have the upper humerus, which is the supporting bone. and the forearm, which consists of the radius and ulna. The radius lies on the lateral or thumb side, and the ulna is on the medial or little finger side. With the wrist and hand, you have modified ball and socket joints formed by the ends of the radius and ulna and wrist bones. There are 8 bones in the wrist called carpal bones. 5 metacarpals extend from the carpal bones and make up the hand, and the fingers are composed of small bones called phalanges. In the pelvis is a closed bony ring consisting of 3 bones: the sacrum, which is the fused vertebra in the back, and 2 large pelvic bones. Each pelvic bone is formed by fusion of the ilium, ischium, and the pubis. These 3 bones are joined posteriorly by the sacrum. Anteriorly, the right pubis and the left pubis are joined by the pubic symphysis, which is a hard, bony, and cartilaginous joint with minimal motion. That's in the front side of the pelvis. The leg connects to the hip joint at the acetabulum, which is the part of the pelvis where the ilium, ischium, and pubic bones meet. Here's an illustration of the pelvis that I just discussed. Posteriorly, you have the ilium, ischium, and pubis bones, which are joined by the sacrum, and anteriorly, which is in the front, you have the pubic symphysis, which is where the right and left pubis bones are joined. Then you have the lower extremities. The first we're going to discuss is the femur or thigh bones, but the lower extremities main parts are the thigh, leg, and foot. So if we start in the thigh with the femur, that's also the thigh bone. It's the longest and one of the strongest bones in the body. At the superior bone of the head is called the femoral head, and it's a round ball-like structure and is what fits up into the pelvis. The femoral head connects to the acetabulum, which is the pelvic girdle, by a ball and socket joint. The femoral head attaches to the shaft of the femur through the femoral neck. There are 2 projections where major muscles of the thigh connect to the femur. You have the greater trochanter, which is lateral superior, and the lesser trochanter, which is the medial or inferior. The knee connects the upper leg to the lower leg, and it is a hinge joint with a specialized bone called the patella or kneecap. The lower leg consists of the tibia, which is the shin bone, which lies on the anterior of the leg, and the fibula, which lies on the lateral side of the leg. The ankle is a hinge joint, and it allows flexion and extension of the foot. The foot contains 7 tarsal bones. The talus and calcaneus are the largest bones. The talus joins with the distal tibia and fibula to form the ankle joint. The calcaneus forms the prominence of the heel. There are 5 metatarsal bones that form the substance of the foot, and the plantar surface is the bottom surface of the foot, while the dorsum is the top of the foot. There are 5 toes that are formed by 14 phalanges in total. You have 2 phalanges in the great toe, or large toe, and then 30 phalanges in each of the smaller toes. So just to remind you, the skeletal system is what gives the body its shape, protects fragile organs, allows for movement. It also stores calcium and helps create blood cells. Now let's move on to the musculoskeletal system. The musculoskeletal system provides form, upright posture, movement, and protection of vital internal organs. There are 3 types of muscles: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. The skeletal muscle attaches bones to the skeleton and forms the major muscle mass of the body. It's also called voluntary muscle because it's under direct voluntary control of the brain. Movement of the body results from skeletal muscle contraction or relaxation. Most muscles of the body operate on the principle of antagonistic parts. For example, the biceps work to slow the movement of the triceps as the arm is extended. Smooth muscle is found within blood vessels and intestines, and then cardiac muscle is only found within the heart. This figure shows the major muscles of the human body. Now let's talk about the physiology of the musculoskeletal system. Contraction and relaxation of the system makes it possible to move and manipulate in the environment. A byproduct of this movement is heat. When you get cold, you shiver, which is when you involuntarily shake muscles, and this helps to produce heat. Another function of muscles is to protect structures under them. The respiratory system consists of structures of the body that contribute to the process of breathing or respiration. The upper airway consists of the nose, the mouth, which is the oral cavity, tongue, the jaw, which is the mandible, and the larynx, which is the voice box. And this divides the line between the upper and lower airway. It's a complex arrangement of tiny bones, cartilage, muscles, and vocal cords that make up the larynx. Then you have the pharynx, which consists of the nasopharynx, oropharynx, which is in the throat, and the laryngopharynx, which is at the base of the laryngopharynx, are the trachea and the esophagus posteriorly. You also have the trachea or windpipe, which is located at the bottom of the pharynx, and it's a semi-rigid enclosed air tube made up of rings of cartilage. Continuing down, you have the epiglottis, which is a thin leaf-shaped flap that prevents food and liquid from entering the trachea, and the esophagus, which is immediately posterior to the trachea, where food and liquids enter the pharynx and pass into the esophagus, which carries them to the stomach. You have the cricoid cartilage, which is immediately below the thyroid cartilage. The cricothyroid membrane, which is between the thyroid and cricoid cartilage. Then you have the trachea, which is below the cricoid cartilage, and the trachea ends at what's called the carina. The carina divides into two tubes, which are the right and left main stem bronchi, where air enters the lungs and branches then into smaller airways. The two lungs are held in place by the trachea, arteries and veins, and pulmonary ligaments. Each lung is divided into lobes. The right lung has an upper, middle, and lower lobe, and the left lung has an upper and lower lobe. Within the lobes are the bronchi and bronchioles, which end in small grape-like sacs called the alveoli. Alveoli are where gas exchange takes place between oxygen and carbon dioxide. Then you have a pleural, which is a layer of smooth, glistening tissue that covers each lung and lines the chest cavities. Between those two layers is a small amount of fluid that allows the tissues to glide smoothly. Lungs, as I was just discussing. The muscles involved in breathing include the diaphragm, which is the primary muscle of breathing and is what divides the thorax from the abdomen. Its automatic function is breathing. Then you have the intercostal muscles, and during inhalation, the diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract, moving the ribs up and out, enlarging the chest cavity, and decreasing pressure in the lungs and moving air in. During exhalation, the diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax, decreasing the chest cavity, increasing the pressure in the lungs, and moving air out. You also have cervical muscles in the neck, which are involved, and abdominal muscles and pectoral muscles. The respiratory system's function is to provide the body with oxygen and eliminate carbon dioxide. Ventilation and respiration are two separate yet interdependent functions of the respiratory system. Respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the alveoli and in the tissues of the body. It provides much needed oxygen to the cells and removes the waste carbon dioxide. Oxygen passes from the blood through the capillaries to tissue cells, and carbon dioxide passes back. Diffusion is the passive process in which oxygen molecules move from an area with a higher concentration of molecules to an area of lower concentration. The brainstem automatically controls breathing if the level of carbon dioxide or oxygen in arterial blood is too high or too low. The medulla keeps us breathing so we do not have to think about it. It initiates the ventilation cycles, it's stimulated by high carbon dioxide levels, and sets a base pattern for respirations. The pons has two areas that help augment respirations during emotional or physical stress and are involved in changing the depth of inspiration or expiration or both. And the medulla and pons are located at the base of the brain, just above the brain stem. Ventilation is a simple movement of air in and out of the lungs. It requires chest rise and fall. You provide ventilation when you assist a patient with a bag valve mask. The tidal volume is the amount of air that is moved into or out of the lungs during a single breath. Residual volume is the gas that remains in the lungs to keep the lungs open. Then you have what is known as the dead space, which is the portion of the respiratory system that has no alveoli and therefore where little or no gas of exchange happens between air and blood. Then you have minute volume, which is the amount of air that moves in and out of the lungs in 1 minute minus the dead space. So the respiratory rate times the tidal volume equals the minute volume. Always evaluate the amount of air being moved with each breath when assessing a patient's respirations. With normal breathing, you have normal rate and depth, or tidal volume, a regular rhythm or pattern of inhalation and exhalation, and clear audible breath sounds on both sides of the chest, regular rise and fall movement on both sides of the chest, and movement of the abdomen. With inadequate breathing patterns, you have labored breathing, which requires effort and may involve accessory muscles, and is much slower or faster than breathing as usual. You have muscle retractions above the clavicles, between the ribs, and below the rib cage, especially in children. And the skin can appear pale or cyanotic, which is blue, and be cool or damp and clammy. The skin can be cool, damp, or clammy. And the patient is usually sitting in the tripod position, which is leaning forward on their arms, with their arms resting on their knees. And there may be agonal gasping, which are gasping breaths after the heart has stopped, which is cardiac arrest. Now let's move on to the anatomy of the circulatory system. The circulatory system, or the cardiovascular system, is a complex arrangement of connected tubes, consisting of arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. There are two circuits. You have systemic circulation, which is the body, which carries oxygen-rich blood from the left ventricle through the body and back to the right atrium, and pulmonary circulation in the lungs, which carries oxygen-poor blood from the right ventricle through the lungs and back into the left atrium of the heart. Here's an example of the circulatory system, where you see oxygen-rich blood leaving in red and oxygen-poor blood returning to be reoxygenated here in blue. The heart is a hollow muscular organ that is approximately the size of an adult's clenched fist. It's made up of specialized cardiac muscle called myocardium, and it works as two paired pumps. There's a septum that divides the right and left sides. Each side is divided into the atrium, which is the upper chamber, and the ventricle, which is the lower chamber. The heart receives its blood from the aorta. The right side of the heart receives blood from the veins of the body. The blood enters from the superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium and fills the right ventricle. As the right ventricle contracts, blood flows into the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary circulation system. Oxygenated blood returns from the lungs through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium and passes through a valve into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, the blood is pumped into the aorta and then the arteries of the body. A one-way valve governs the exit of blood from each of the four heart chambers. The one-way valves prevent backflow of blood. When a valve controlling entry to a heart chamber is open, the valve that controls the exit is shut, and vice versa. This figure shows the right and left sides of the heart. The normal pulse rate for an adult, or HR, normal heart rate for an adult is 60 to 100 beats per minute. The stroke volume, or SV, is the amount of blood moved by one beat. The cardiac output, or CO, is the amount of blood moved in 1 minute. So the cardiac output equals the normal heart rate times the stroke volume. In 1 minute, the body's entire blood volume of 5 to 6 liters is circulated through all the vessels. The electrical conduction system is a network of specialized tissue that is capable of conducting electrical current that runs throughout the heart. The flow of electrical current causes smooth, coordinated heart contractions. Each mechanical contraction is associated with two electrical processes. You have depolarization, where the electrical charge on the surface of the muscle cell is changed from positive to negative, and repolarization, where the heart returns to its resting state and positive charge is restored to the surface. Electrical impulses begin high in the atria at the sinoatrial node, travel to the atrioventricular node and bundle of His, and then move through the Purkinje fibers to the ventricles. This movement produces a smooth flow of electricity, leading to a coordinated pumping action. When the conduction system is injured, the heart will not beat properly. Arteries carry blood from the heart to all body tissues. They contract to accommodate loss of blood and increased blood pressure so as to supply tissues as needed. The aorta is the main artery, leaving the left side of the heart and carrying freshly oxygenated blood to the entire body. It has many branches that supply the vital organs. The coronary arteries supply the heart, carotid arteries supply the head, hepatic arteries supply the liver, renal arteries supply the kidneys, mesenteric arteries supply the digestive system. This divides the level of the umbilicus into two iliac arteries. You have the pulmonary artery that originates at the right ventricle of the heart and carries oxygen-poor blood to the lungs for reoxygenation. Arteries branch into a series of increasingly smaller vessels until they connect to the vast network of capillaries. Pulse is palpated most easily at the neck, wrist, or groin, and is created by the forceful pumping of blood out of the left ventricle and into the major arteries. This figure shows the major arteries of the human body, and you can see where they branch at the umbilicus into two larger arteries that supply the legs. Capillaries are tiny blood vessels that connect arterioles to venules. These allow contact between blood and the cells of the tissues. Oxygen and nutrients pass from blood cells and plasma in the capillaries to individual tissue cells through very thin walls of capillaries, and there are literally billions of capillaries in the body. Veins return oxygen-depleted blood to the heart. The blood moves from the venules to the heart via a network of larger and larger veins. The major veins are the superior vena cava, which carries blood returning from the head, neck, shoulders, and upper extremities. The inferior vena cava carries blood from the abdomen, pelvis, and lower extremities. The superior and inferior vena cava join at the right atrium of the heart. Now let's talk about the spleen. The spleen is a solid organ located under the rib cage in the left upper part of the abdomen. It filters worn-out blood cells, foreign substances, and bacteria from the blood. It's highly vascular and is particularly susceptible to injury from blunt force trauma and can lead to severe internal bleeding. Blood composition is made up of plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Plasma, which is the liquid portion of blood, contains water, which is its primary component, proteins, which is a primary component, and then oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, nutrients, and cellular wastes. The red blood cells, or erythrocytes they're also called, contain hemoglobin, which gives blood its color, and carry oxygen. White blood cells, which are called leukocytes, play a role in the body's immune system to defense fight against infection. And platelets are essential in the initial formation of a blood clot. Let's talk about the physiology of the circulatory system. Blood pressure is pressure that the blood exerts against the walls of the arteries. Systole is when the left ventricle of the heart contracts and it pumps blood from the ventricle into the aorta. Diastole is when the muscle of the ventricle relaxes and the ventricle fills with blood. Forceful ejection of blood from the left ventricle into the aorta is transmitted through the arteries as pulsatile pressure wave. It can be measured with a blood pressure cuff, or a systolic blood pressure is the high wave of the heart as it's contracting, and diastolic blood pressure is the low point of the wave as the heart is in relaxation phase. Normal circulation in adults is automatically adjusted and controlled. Perfusion is called the circulation of blood in an organ or a tissue in adequate amounts to meet the current needs of the cells. When blood enters the organs and tissues through the arteries and then leaves through the veins. This is an example of blood entering the organs and tissues through the arteries and then leaving the organs and tissues through veins. So once the oxygen's been used, then it leaves through the veins, goes back up to the heart and lungs to be reoxygenated. With inadequate circulation in adults, the system can adjust to compensate for a small blood loss. Vessels will constrict and the heart will pump more rapidly. With a large loss, this adjustment fails and the patient goes into shock. It can be expressed by the following formula. Mean arterial pressure equals heart rate times stroke volume times systemic vascular resistance, or MAP equals HR times SV times SVR. The functions of blood are providing perfusion, transporting oxygen, transporting carbon dioxide, transporting waste and nutrients, and clotting or coagulation. Let's talk about nervous system control of the cardiovascular system. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the fight or flight response. This sends commands to adrenal glands, and epinephrine and norepinephrine are then secreted to stimulate heart and blood vessels. The popular names of these hormones are adrenaline and noradrenaline. Blood vessels have alpha-adrenic receptors. When stimulated, the blood vessels constrict, increasing blood pressure. The heart and lungs have beta-adrenic receptors, and when stimulated, the heart rate increases. Bronchi in the lungs dilate, allowing more air to be inhaled and exhaled. The parasympathetic nervous system addresses actions that do not require an immediate response, and when stimulated, they cause the heart to slow and beat more weakly. The opposition between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems allows the body to respond appropriately. Now moving on to nervous system anatomy and physiology, you need to bear in mind that the nervous system is perhaps the most complex organ system in the body, and it's divided into two main portions. The central nervous system, or CNS, is the brain and spinal cord. The brain is the controlling organ of the body. And then you also have the peripheral nervous system. The brain is the controlling organ of the body, and the major subdivisions of the brain are the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain and contains 4 lobes, frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital, which are each responsible for specific functions such as sight, hearing, balance, and speech. And each side of the brain controls activity on the opposite side of the body. The cerebellum coordinates body movements, and the brainstem controls body functions necessary for life, including cardiac and respiratory functions and regulations of consciousness. There are three areas of the brainstem, which are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The spinal cord is an extension of the brain stem. It's made up of nerve fibers that extend from the cells of the brain and join together below the brainstem to and from the spinal cord. These transmit messages between the brain and the body. And it's encased within the spinal canal, inside the vertebrae that make up the back, and cerebrospinal fluid cushions the brain and spinal cord. Then you have the peripheral nervous system, which is divided into two main portions, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system consists of nerves outside the brain and spinal cord that link the CNS to various organs of the body. It consists of long fibers that extend from the cell body out through openings in the bony covering of the back to form a cable of nerve fibers that link the CNS to various organs of the body. The divisions of the peripheral nervous system are the somatic nervous system, which is voluntary, and this transmits signal from the brain to voluntary muscles and allows for activities such as walking, talking, and writing. The autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary, controls involuntary actions necessary for basic body functions, such as digestion, dilation, constriction of blood vessels, and sweating. This is split into two areas: the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which slows down the body. The two types of nerves within the peripheral nervous system are sensory nerves that carry information from the body to the CNS, constantly providing information to the brain about what different parts of the body are doing in relation to their surroundings. And the motor nerves carry information from the brain to muscles. Each muscle in the body has its own motor nerve. The electrical impulses produced by cell bodies in the spinal cord are transmitted along the motor nerves to the muscle, causing it to contract. Now we're going to discuss the integumentary system or skin system anatomy. There are two layers of skin. You have the epidermis, which is superficial and is sealed to form a watertight protective covering. It varies in thickness in different areas of the body and is composed of several layers of cells. You have the germinal layer, which produces new cells, the stratum corneal layer, which is the surface layer of dead cells, and skin cells are constantly being replaced. Then you have the dermis, which is the deeper portion of the skin, and this contains special structures of the skin. It contains the sweat glands that produce sweat for cooling the body, subcutaneous glands that secrete sebum, which provide waterproofing and softening, hair follicles that are small organs that produce hair, blood vessels that provide nutrients and oxygen to the skin, mucous membranes that cover bodily orifices such as the mouth, nose, and vagina, and provide a protective barrier like skin, and secrete mucus, which is a watery substance that lubricates these openings. Muscle membranes are moist, whereas the skin is dry. Below the skin lies the subcutaneous tissue, which is a layer of fat that serves as an insulator and energy reservoir. This figure shows the different layers of the skin that I just discussed. The skin is the largest single organ of the body, and it has three major functions. It protects the body in the environment and protects the body from infectious organisms. It helps regulate body temperature, and sweat is secreted to the skin surface from the sweat glands. And then it also transmits information from the environment to the brain, so the skin reacts to pressure, pain, and pleasurable stimuli. Now we're going to discuss the anatomy of the digestive system. Digestion is the processing of food that nourishes the individual cells of the body. The digestive system is also called the gastrointestinal system. It contains the major organs of digestion and excretion and is organized into four quadrants: the right upper, right lower, and left lower. The abdomen is the second major body cavity, the first being the thoracic cavity. The abdomen is the second major body cavity and contains the major organs of digestion and excretion. The quadrants are the easiest way to identify areas. Right upper quadrant contains the liver, gallbladder, and a portion of the colon. The left upper quadrant contains the stomach, spleen, and a portion of the colon. The right lower quadrant contains two portions of the large intestine, the cecum and ascending colon, and the appendix is attached to the lower cecum. And then you have the left lower quadrant, which contains the descending and sigmoid portion of the colon. The quadrants refer to the patient's right and left. So right upper quadrant is RUQ, left upper quadrant is LUQ, right lower quadrant is RLQ, and the left lower quadrant is LLQ. And again, these quadrants refer to the patient's right and left. The small intestine, pancreas, large intestine, and urinary bladder lie in more than one quadrant. The kidneys and pancreas lie behind the abdominal cavity and are not included in the body cavity itself. The mouth consists of lips, cheeks, gums, teeth, and tongue. It also has salivary glands. There are two sets, one on each side of the mouth and in front of each ear. Saliva serves as a binder for chewed food and as a lubricant. You also have the oropharynx, which is a tubular structure that extends from the back of the mouth to the esophagus and trachea. The esophagus is a collapsible tube about 10 inches long, and it extends from the pharynx to the stomach. The muscles in the wall of the esophagus propel food to the stomach. The stomach is a hollow organ in the left upper quadrant. It receives food, stores it, and provides force movement into the bowel. The pancreas is a flat solid organ that lies below and behind the liver and stomach. There are two portions of the pancreas, the exocrine and endocrine. The exocrine portion secretes pancreatic juice containing enzymes that aid in digestion of fat, starch, and protein. And the endocrine portion, or also known as the islets of Langerhans, produce insulin and glucagon. The liver is a large solid organ immediately beneath the diaphragm in the right upper quadrant, or RUQ, extending into the left upper quadrant, or LUQ. The largest solid organ in the abdomen is the liver, and it's made up of a large mass of blood vessels and cells. The liver has many functions, filtering harmful substances, forming the factors needed for blood clotting and normal plasma production, and is the principal organ for storing sugar or starch for immediate use by the body for energy. It also has bile ducts, and the major function of the bile duct is the digestion of fat. The bile duct connects the liver to the intestine, and the gallbladder is a small pouch extending from the bile ducts that serves as a reservoir and concentrating organ for bile produced in the liver. The small intestine is a major hollow organ of the abdomen. It produces enzymes and mucus to aid in digestion. It is composed of the duodenum, which receives food from the stomach and is right at the bottom of the stomach, the jejunum, and then the ileum. More than 90% of the products of digestion are absorbed across the wall of the small intestine into the veins. The large intestine is a major hollow organ consisting of the cecum, colon, and rectum. The major function of the colon is to absorb the final 5 to 10% of digested food and water from the intestine to form a solid stool. The appendix is a 3 to 4 inch long tube that opens into the cecum, which is the first part of the large intestine, into the right lower quadrant of the abdomen. It may easily become obstructed, inflamed, or infected, which produces appendicitis. And appendicitis is one of the major causes of severe abdominal distress. The rectum is the lowermost end of the colon and is a large hollow organ adapted to hold quantities of feces until it is ready to be expelled. At its terminal end is the anus, and both the rectum and the anus have sphincters, which are complex circular muscles that control the escape of liquids, gases, and solids from the digestive tract. Let's discuss the physiology of the digestive system. Digestion is a complicated chemical process. Enzymes are added to food by the salivary glands, stomach, liver, pancreas, and small intestine. and then food is converted into basic sugars, fatty acids, and amino acids. These basic products of digestion are carried across the wall of the intestine to the liver and processed further and stored or transported to the heart. It's circulated via blood throughout the body. Now let's discuss the lymphatic system. The elements of the lymphatic system include the spleen, lymph nodes, lymph vessels, the thymus gland, and some other components. It supports the circulatory system and immune system. Lymph is a thin, straw-colored fluid that carries oxygen, nutrients, and hormones to the cells and waste products of metabolism away from the cells to be excreted. Lymph vessels form a network throughout the body that serve as an auxiliary to the circulatory system. It relies on muscle contractions and movements of the body for lymph to flow. Lymph nodes are tiny oval-shaped structures that filter lymph. That helps to rid the body of toxins and other harmful materials. Now we're going to discuss the endocrine system, anatomy, and physiology. The endocrine system is a complex message and control system and integrates many body functions. It has endocrine glands that release hormones directly into the bloodstream. Some examples are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and insulin. And each endocrine gland produces one or more hormones. The brain controls the release of the hormones and causes also excesses or deficiencies in hormones can cause disease. So the brain controls the release of the hormones, and then if you have excesses or deficiencies of hormones, it can cause disease through various parts of the body, depending on which one is out of sync. Now the urinary system, anatomy, and physiology we'll discuss next, and the urinary system controls the discharge of certain waste materials filtered from the blood by the kidneys. The kidneys are solid organs. The ureters, bladder, and urethra are hollow organs. The main function of the urinary system is to control fluid balance in the body. It also filters and eliminates waste and controls pH balance. The body has two kidneys that lie in the retroperitoneal space. Kidneys get rid of blood, toxic waste products, and control the balance of water and salt. Waste products and water are constantly filtered from blood to form urine. The kidneys concentrate this filtered urine by reabsorbing the water as it passes through a system of specialized tubes. A ureter passes from each kidney to drain into the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder is located immediately behind the pubic symphysis in the pelvic cavity, and then the bladder empties to the outside of the body through the urethra. Now let's discuss anatomy and physiology of the genital system. The genital system controls the reproductive processes by which life is created. The male reproductive system consists of the testicles, epididymis, vasa differentia, prostate gland, seminal vesicles, and penis. It lies outside the pelvic cavity except for the prostate gland and seminal vesicles. It produces sperm and sex hormones, and the penis is also part of the urinary system, which contains the urethra. This figure shows the organs of the male reproductive system that I just discussed. The female reproductive system consists of the ovaries, fallopian tubes, uterus, cervix, and vagina. It is contained entirely within the pelvic cavity except for the clitoris and labia. It produces egg cells called ovum and sex hormones. Both of those come from the ovaries themselves. This figure shows the female reproductive system as I just described. Now let's discuss the life support chain. Cells are the foundation of the human body, and all cells in the body require oxygen, nutrients, and removal of waste. The circulatory and respiratory systems are the carriers of these supplies and waste. If interference occurs, cells become damaged and die. Cells use oxygen to take available nutrients and turn them into chemical energy through metabolism. You have adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is used to store energy. And aerobic metabolism uses oxygen. The brain and heart require constant supplies of oxygen. Most cells switch to anaerobic metabolism when oxygen is limited. Lactic acid is a damaging waste product of this process. Movement of oxygen waste and nutrients occurs by the process of diffusion through cell walls. pH is critical to diffusion and is a measure of acidity or alkalinity. The body expends a large amount of energy to maintain normal pH levels. Now we're going to talk about pathophysiology. Pathophysiology is the study of functional changes that occur when the body reacts to disease. Many diseases can occur in patients. Diabetes is a disease of the pancreas, stroke is a disease of the brain, pneumonia is a disease of the lungs. Those are just 3 examples. Respiratory compromise is the inability of the body to move gas efficiently. This can lead to hypoxia, which is decreased level of oxygen in the body, and hypercarbia, which is elevated level of carbon dioxide in the body. Factors that can impair ventilation are blocked airway, impairment of the muscles of breathing, and the airway is obstructed, or if the airway is obstructed physiologically, like through an asthma attack. There are numerous other factors, like drug overdose, trauma to chest wall, or an allergic reaction. Factors that can impair respiration are change in the atmosphere, such as high altitudes, and impaired movement of the gas across the cell membrane. Then you have what's called the VQ ratio, which is the ventilation-perfusion mismatch. The VQ ratio describes how much gas is being moved effectively through the lungs and how much blood is flowing around the alveoli where gas change or perfusion occurs. A mismatch occurs when one of these 2 variables is abnormal, and then respiratory compromise can occur. The effects of respiratory compromise in the body are the oxygen levels throughout the body fall and carbon dioxide levels rise. The brain detects an increase in carbon dioxide levels. The body increases its respiratory rate in an attempt to return to the carbon dioxide levels to normal. If increased respiratory rate does not occur or is not effective in returning carbon dioxide levels to normal, the blood will become more acidic. Similarly, blood oxygen levels begin to fall, and this will cause the brain to issue further commands to breathe. That's why you have increased respiration. Now let's talk about shock. This is a condition in which organ and tissues receive an inadequate flow of blood and oxygen or perfusion. It can occur due to inadequacy of the central or peripheral circulation, and impaired oxygen delivery causes cellular hypoxia. This can lead to anaerobic metabolism, lactic acid production, and organ dysfunction. And shock is categorized into several types depending on the cause. The effects of shock on the body are similar to the effects of respiratory compromise in that the level of oxygen supplied to the tissue falls. Then the cells engage in anaerobic metabolism, which results in lactic acid production. There are several metabolic acidosis severe metabolic acidosis ensues, leading to increased levels of carbon dioxide within the blood. Baroreceptors detect decreased blood pressure and initiate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. The heart rate increases, the heartbeat is more forceful, and blood vessels constrict. Interstitial fluid moves into the capillaries, and once a certain level of tissue hypoperfusion is reached, cell damage proceeds in a similar manner regardless of the underlying cause of the shock. Impairment of cellular metabolism results in the inability to properly use oxygen and glucose at the cellular level. When there is inadequate oxygen, cells will create energy through anaerobic metabolism. This serves as a temporary backup system and can result in metabolic acidosis. It requires more energy than when using glucose for fuel. There are more waste to remove from the body, and the body must work harder. There's also decreased ability of the blood to effectively carry oxygen to the cells. Overall, decreased functioning of oxygen within the cell occurs, and the brain cannot use alternative fuels. It relies on a constant supply of glucose to function, and if the available supply of glucose is dramatically decreased, brain cells will quickly become damaged or die. So cellular injury up to a point may be reparable if normal tissue perfusion is restored. When irreversible injury occurs, no treatment will help. Class, thank you for your time and attention to this lecture. It is complex. As you noticed, I gave you a lot more information than what is on the slides themselves, and there is even more information in the book. This is the most critical chapter in all the chapters you're going to study in this class, so please take the time to study this chapter carefully. If you have any questions, please ask your instructor for clarification, and it's a good idea to form study groups to cover anatomy and physiology because it is very complicated. So let's go over some review questions. Review question 1. Which of the following are found in the retroperitoneal space? We just went over this. So in the retroperitoneal space, do you find the liver, the spleen, the kidneys, or the stomach? The correct answer is C, the kidneys. The kidneys lie in the retroperitoneal space, which is the space behind the abdominal cavity, which is why they're not included if you find trouble in the abdomen. The spleen, liver, and stomach are all located in the anterior or true abdomen. Okay, here are the other answers that were given. A, which is the liver, and that's incorrect because the liver lies immediately beneath the diaphragm in the anterior abdomen. The spleen, which was an incorrect answer because the spleen lies under the rib cage in the left upper quadrant of the abdominal cavity. Of course, C, kidneys, is the correct answer. They have the retroperitoneal space behind the abdominal cavity. And the fourth alternative you had was stomach, and that's incorrect because the stomach lies in the left upper quadrant of the abdominal cavity, the true abdominal cavity. Question 2. The cartilaginous tip of the sternum is called the costal arch, the manubrium, angle of Lewis, or the xiphoid process. I'll give you a hint. Anything that sticks out from the skeleton is called a process. So that ought to give you a pretty good clue right there. And the answer is, of course, D, the xiphoid process. It projects from the lower part of the sternum. It's made of cartilage, and relative to other parts of the sternum, e.g. the manubrium or angle of Lewis, it is soft to palpation. Therefore, it is important where you place your hands during CPR. You can dislodge the xiphoid process, and it's shaped like an arrowhead, and even though it is cartilaginous, it is still sharp enough to do a lot of severe damage. So you want to make sure that you have your hands in the right place and not place any pressure on the xiphoid process, which can snap off if you're doing CPR incorrectly. So let's look at the other answers and see why they were incorrect. The cartilaginous tip of the sternum is called the costal arch. That's incorrect because the costal arch is the bridge of cartilage that connects the ends of the 6th through 10th ribs to the lower sternum. The manubrium is incorrect because this is the upper section of the sternum, one of 3 parts. The angle of Lewis is incorrect because this is found at the level where the 2nd rib is attached to the sternum. And of course, the correct answer, as we just reviewed, is the xiphoid process. Question 3. A person with a bilateral femur fracture has fractured one or more of his or her femurs, fractured both of his or her femurs, one femur attached in 2 places, or fractured the lateral aspect of the femur. So think about it. Bilateral meaning both sides. So if you have someone with bilateral femur fractures, let's see what the correct answer is. And the correct answer to the question is B. The term bilateral refers to both sides of the body with reference to the midline. Therefore, bilateral femur fractures would indicate that both femurs are fractured. Let's look at the other parts of the question and see why those were incorrect. A person with bilateral femur fractures has fractured one or more of his or her femurs. That's incorrect because bilateral means two, both sides of the body. And of course, that's the correct answer on B, fractured both femurs. C is incorrect because it says that one femur is fractured in two places. That's not correct because the terminology bilateral means that one fracture is occurred on both sides of the body. A bilateral fracture is one fracture that occurs in two bones. The D gave you the alternative of fracture of the lateral aspect of the femur. That's incorrect because that means the outside portion of the femur itself is broken, but that would be only on one side. The question is asking you about fractures on both sides. Those are bilateral fractures. Question 4. The most prominent landmark on the anterior surface of the neck is the mastoid process, the cricoid cartilage, the thyroid cartilage, or the cricothyroid membrane. And we talked about this. It's also referred to as the Adam's apple. So let's look and see what the correct answer is. The correct answer is C. The thyroid cartilage, commonly referred to as the Adam's apple, is the most prominent landmark on the anterior, which is the front surface of the neck. The cricoid cartilage is located directly inferior to or below the thyroid cartilage. It is a less prominent landmark. And people typically think that females do not have Adam's apples and males do. Females have them as well. They just are not as prominent. But they are structurally the same as men. Now let's look at the other alternatives and see why they were incorrect. Number 4 said the most prominent landmark on the anterior or front surface of the neck is the mastoid process. That's incorrect because the mastoid process is the prominent bony mass at the base of the skull. It gave you the cricoid cartilage, and that's incorrect because that is the firm ridge of cartilage that's inferior to or below the thyroid cartilage. C is correct, that is the thyroid cartilage. And D, the cricothyroid membrane, that's incorrect because that's the thin sheet of connective tissue that joins the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. Question 5. Insulin is produced in the liver, pancreas, thyroid glands, or adrenal glands. Considering that diabetes is such a problem, I think you can probably get this one pretty easily. And it is, of course, B. The pancreas is a solid organ that produces both insulin and digestive juices. Insulin is produced in the islet of Langerhans, which are part of the pancreas. Let's look at the other alternatives and see why they're incorrect. The liver, which is incorrect because the liver produces or takes care of the poisonous byproducts of digestion and are rendered harmless in the liver. So the liver filters the blood of poisonous byproducts. B, pancreas is the correct answer. C, thyroid gland is incorrect because the thyroid, which is found in the neck over the larynx, regulates the body's metabolism. And adrenal glands are incorrect because these are the glands which are located in the kidneys. They regulate salt and sugar levels and sexual function. Let's look at question 6. Blank connects muscles to bones. Ligaments, cartilage, tendons, and joints. If you remember that ligaments connect bone to bone, then you can probably guess which is the correct answer here. And it is C. Tendons connect muscle to bone. Ligaments connect bone to bone. Cartilage is smooth connective tissue covering the ends of the bones at mobile joints, and joints consist of the ends of the bones and the surrounding and connecting supporting tissues. So I'm not going to review the other alternatives on number 6 because we just covered them in the correct answer. But it is tendons that connect muscle to bones, and ligaments which connect bone to bone. That's the easiest way to remember it. Question 7. The normal resting adult heart rate is 50 to 70 beats per minute, 60 to 100 beats per minute, 80 to 110 beats per minute, or 110 to 120 beats per minute. This is really important for you to remember. So let's see what the correct answer. B. The normal resting heart rate for an adult is 60 to 100 beats per minute. Bradycardia exists when the adult heart rate is less than 60 beats a minute, and tachycardia exists when it is greater than 100 beats per minute. So let's look at some of the other alternatives and see why they're incorrect. The normal resting adult heart rate is 50 to 70 beats per minute. Less than 60 beats per minute is considered bradycardia. Not good. That means there's just not enough oxygen moving through the body. 60 to 100 beats per minute is the correct answer. 80 to 100 to 10 beats per minute is normal. Normal is more than 100 beats per minute. So normal is no more than 100 beats per minute. So for 80 to 110 beats per minute, they're getting a little bit tachycardic. And 110 to 120 beats per minute, the answer is more than 100 beats per minute is moving straight into tachycardia. So the correct answer again is 60 to 100 beats per minute. Anything less and you're touching or are in bradycardia. Anything more, you're touching or are into tachycardia. Review question 8. The left atrium of the heart receives blank blood from the blank. And the options are A, oxygenated blood from the lungs, B, deoxygenated blood from the body, C, oxygenated blood from the body, or D, deoxygenated blood from the lungs. This is really important for you to understand. So let's see what the correct answer is here. Their answer is A. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs via the pulmonary veins. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the body via the vena cava. I'm not going to explain why the wrong answers are wrong, because you need to concentrate and focus on which one is right, which is A. The left atrium of the heart receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. And this is the rest of number 8, which I'm not going to cover. Number 9. The largest part of the brain is the cerebrum, brainstem, cerebellum, or foramen magnum. You could probably get this one right. And it is A. The 3 major parts of the brain are the cerebrum, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The largest part of the brain is the cerebrum, which is sometimes called the gray matter. The cerebellum, sometimes called the athlete's brain, is the smallest part of the brain. And the brainstem itself is responsible for vital functions such as heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure. The foramen magnum is the large opening in the base of the skull through which the spinal cord passes from the brain into the spinal column. So we covered all of the wrong answers in the explanation for the correct answer, so I'm not going to review them here. Question 10. Which of the following statements about red blood cells is false? A. They contain iron. B. They carry oxygen. C. They help to fight infection. And D. They give color to the blood. If you know what the various components of blood are made of, this should be a pretty easy answer. And it is C. The hemoglobin molecules in red blood cells contain iron, which give color to the blood and carry oxygen. But it is not the red blood cells that fight infection. It is white blood cells that play a role in helping the body to fight infection. So if we look at this question again, which of the following statements about red blood cells is false? A, they contain iron. That's not false. It's true. The hemoglobin found in red blood cells carries iron, which gives it its red color. B, they carry oxygen. That's true. The hemoglobin found in the red blood cells carries oxygen. C, they help to fight infection, and that's false because the correct answer is that white blood cells carry or fight infection in the bloodstream. And D, which of the following statements about red blood cells is false? They give color to the blood. That's not false. It's actually true. Hemoglobin found in red blood cells gives blood its color, as I mentioned just a moment ago. Okay, class, again, thank you for your time, attention, and concentration on this very complicated subject. Again, let me state that this is the most important chapter that you will cover in EMT class. So please form study groups, get study partners, and if you have any confusion or need any kind of clarification, please discuss this with your instructor. Thank you, and I look forward to discussing with you in Chapter 7.